Buenos días con todos. Good morning, everyone. Soy Carla Sainz.
Good morning,
Soy
everyone.
asesora
My name
regional
is
de
Carla
bioética de la
Sáenz.
OPS.
I am the regional advisor
Vamos
on
a dar
bioethics
por
of the Pan American
inicio
Health
nuestra
Organization,
sesión
and
virtual
we
del
will
día
be
de hoy.
starting our
I'm gonna
session
start with
today.
some housekeeping issues. Please, if you want to listen to this webinar in English, click on the little globe and choose English as your language. Estimados colegas que hablan español, si
For those
usted para
colleagues who speak
escuchar las
Spanish, if you wish
presentaciones en
to listen
español,
to the
por
presentations
favor
in
vaya
Spanish,
al globo
please click on
que
the
puede aparecer
globe at the
donde
bottom of
dice
your
azul con tres
screen,
puntitos de más. Ahí el globo
and it appears
dice
as a circle with three little dots in it.
interpretación
Once you click
y
on that, there'll
haga
be a
clic en
globe that says
interpretación y
interpretation.
escoja que el
Click
audio
on
aparezca en
interpretation
español porque
and
vamos a
select
tener
the language you wish
una
to
sesión
listen to
en
in Spanish
inglés.
for Spanish or English for English.
Ok, ahora continuamos
Now,
la sesión, la
we will
presentación.
continue with the session
Es
and the
un gusto
presentations.
darles la bienvenida a esta
It's
sesión,
a
que
great
es
pleasure
nuestro
to
primer
welcome you to
seminario
this session.
virtual
It is our
sobre temas
first
relacionados con los
virtual
ensayos
seminar
clínicos. Es
on
una nueva
issues
serie
pertaining to
de
clinical
seminarios
trials.
virtuales
It's
que
a whole new
estamos
series
iniciando,
of
que es
virtual
una
seminars that we are
colaboración entre
starting.
el Programa
It
Regional de
involves collaboration
Bioética
between the
de la
Regional
OPS,
Bioethics
que
Program of
hace
the Pan American
parte
Health
del
Organization,
Departamento de
which is
Evidencia
part
e
of the
Inteligencia para la Acción en
Department
Salud,
on Evidence
y
and
la Unidad
Intelligence
de
for
Calidad
Actions
y
in Healthcare,
Regulación de
and the
Medicamentos y
Authority on Quality
Tecnologías
and Regulations
Sanitarias de
of
la OPS, que hace
Medication and
parte de nuestro
Health
Departamento
Technology
de
of the Pan American Health
Innovación
Organization, which is part
y,
of our Department of
y Tecnologías
Innovation
Médicas.
and Medical Technologies.
Los invitamos a
We
participar no
invite
solamente en
you
este,
to
sino en todos los
participate not
seminarios
only in
virtuales de
this, but
esta
all of
serie,
the
donde
virtual seminars we will
discutiremos
be having in
temas
this series,
relacionados
and we
con
will
los
be
ensayos
discussing matters
clínicos
pertaining to
que
clinical
o bien son
trials.
nuevos para nuestra región
Either
o
it's a
son
new issue for our region,
desafiantes para
or they
nuestros
present
países,
major
principalmente me
challenges
refiero a
for our
Latinoamérica
countries.
y el
I'm
Caribe.
referring specifically
Muchos
to
de
Latin
estos
America and the Caribbean.
desafíos, muchas de estas
Many of these
dificultades que
challenges
estos
and
temas abordan,
difficulties that
verán
these
ustedes que
issues
tienen que
address,
ver con la intersección
as you
entre
will
los
see, have
aspectos
to do
éticos y
with the
regulatorios de
intersection
los
between
ensayos
the
clínicos.
regulatory and
El día de
ethical
hoy
aspects of a
tengo el
clinical
gran
trial.
gusto
And
de
today I have the great
presentarles
pleasure of presenting,
presentar este seminario que será sobre la investigación con
introducing rather this
animales
seminar
y el
that has to
rol de
do
los
with
comités para el
research with
cuidado y
animals
uso
and
de
the
animales.
role of committees in
Presentaremos el
the
panorama
care and use of
regulatorio
animals. We
sobre la
will present the
investigación con
regulatory
animales
framework on
en América
doing
Latina y el
research
Caribe
with
y
animals
vamos a presentar
in Latin
también los
America and the
estándares
Caribbean. We will
internacionales para el
also
uso de
be
animales en el
presenting the
laboratorio
international
en la
standards for the use
investigación
of
en consonancia
laboratory
con los
animals
estándares
when doing
internacionales de los que
research
disponemos
to ensure that they
de los
are
que nuestros
consistent
colegas
with
le
the
van a hablar.
international standards
Vamos a
our
iniciar
colleagues will be talking to you
con
about.
una
So we
presentación
will
de la
be beginning
doctora
with a
Nicolette
presentation
Petervary,
by
que
Dr.
es directora de la
Dr.
División de
Nicolette
Políticas y
Petervary. She is the
Educación
director of the
en la
Division on
Oficina del
Policies and
Bienestar
Education
Animal
at
de los
the
Institutos
Office of
Nacionales de la
Animal
Salud de
Welfare
los
at the
Estados
National
Unidos
Institute of
y
Health of
tiene
the
una
United States.
amplia
She
carrera.
has an
Fue
extensive
anteriormente
career in this field. She
especialista
previously
de
was
la
a
am,
specialist.
me queda difícil decirlo en inglés, las instituciones están en
eh,
español,
it's difficult to say it in
especialista
English because the
en el
names are in
bienestar
Spanish, but she was
animal
a
a nivel
specialist
nacional
in
de
animal
la,
welfare at the national level
de
of
la unidad
the
de operaciones animales dentro de los Estados Unidos.
Animal Operations
Em,
Unit
Antes de
in the
trabajar
United
en el
States.
gobierno,
Before
ella
she worked with the government,
hizo investigación en la Universidad de California en
Dr.
Davis y en
Petervary
el campus también de
did
San
research
Francisco.
at the University of
Tiene un doctorado
California in Davis and the San Francisco
medicina
campus.
veterinaria de la
She has a
Universidad
doctorate in
de
veterinary
Pensilvania
medicine from the
y
University of
una
Pennsylvania
maestría
and a master's in
en ciencias biomédicas comparativas de la
Comparative
Universidad
Biomedical
del
Sciences
Estado de Carolina
from
del
the
Norte,
University of
donde
North
se
Carolina.
enfocó en investigación
There, she focused on
de comportamiento de neurociencia.
neuroscience
Entonces,
behavioral
sin más
research.
preámbulo,
So without any further ado,
Dr. Petterberry,
Dr.
please, we are
Pettivori,
very happy to have you with
we
us.
are very happy to have you with us. Please start.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and I'm honored to be here, and thank you for being here. Now, I'm just going to share my screen, and please let me know when you can see.
Yeah, it's fine.
We can see.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to briefly present an overview of the requirements for research involving animals from the National Institutes of Health. And I'm hoping that this will be helpful for you, and we will have time at the end for questions. So my goals are that by the end of this webinar, I hope you will have a better understanding of the requirements for NIH-supported research, the requirements for research institutions within and outside of the United States, and I hope you will be able to find information and resources on the Office of Laboratory and Animal Welfare website, because we have a lot of information that I hope will be useful to you. The Office of Laboratory and Animal Welfare is the division of the National Institutes of Health that oversees animal welfare requirements for NIH-supported research. And these requirements are rooted in the Public Health Service policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals. And the policy itself is very short. It's only 19 pages long, and it includes the Health Research Extension Act of 1985, which provides the legislative mandate for the PHS policy. Excuse me. And it also includes the United States government principles for the utilization and care of vertebrate animals used in testing, research, and training, which includes 9 principles that provide the foundation for the more detailed requirements. The PHS policy, as I mentioned, is short, but it also references other documents, including the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, which provides detailed standards for
Sorry to
animal
interrupt,
care.
Yes. Interrupt you, Nicolette. I think we're having problems with the Spanish translation.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's not clear and loud enough.
Is my
Just give
voice
us
coming through?
1 second.
Mm-hmm.
The volume is a little bit low.
My volume. I can try to increase it a little bit. Hold on just a moment. Let me see if this will help.
Continuamos. Okay, let's continue, Nicolette.
Okay, is this better? Okay, so the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, as I mentioned, is the division that oversees animal welfare requirements for NIH-supported research. And the core document that we use is the PHS policy. And while it's very short, it includes a number of documents that provide guidance on animal care and use programs in much more detail. And these include the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, otherwise just known as the Guide, the Animal Welfare Act and Animal Welfare Regulations, and the American Veterinary Medical Association Guidelines for the Euthanasia of Animals. And each of the included and referenced documents contribute uniquely to the NIH animal welfare requirements. As I mentioned, the Health Research Extension Act of 1985 provides the legislative mandate for the PHS policy. That's what gives us the authority to ask for these things. The U.S. government principles provide an ethical framework, as do the international guiding principles for biomedical research involving animals, which you'll hear more about later. The PHS policy implements the Health Research Extension Act. The Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals is a widely accepted primary reference on animal care and use, and it's very useful because its emphasis is on the use of performance standards and based on published data, scientific principles, expert opinion, and experience with the methods and practices that have proved to be consistent with both high-quality research and humane animal care. The Animal Welfare Act is the principal federal statute governing the sale, handling, transport, and use of animals in the United States and its territories, and it includes requirements for research and applies to all species of warm-blooded vertebrate animals used for research, testing, or teaching, except farm animals used for agricultural research. It also excludes rats of the genus Rattus and mice of the genus Mus and birds bred for use in research. The Animal Welfare Act provides the basis and the legislative mandate for the Animal Welfare Act regulations. And lastly, the American Veterinary Medical Association guidelines for the euthanasia of animals provides detailed recommendations for euthanasia from a panel of veterinary experts. You can find all of those documents on our website. Our NIH animal welfare requirements only apply to projects that are supported by the Public Health Service, and that includes the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, and Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. They also apply to funding agencies that have a memorandum of understanding with OLA to apply the PHS policy, and currently these include the Veterans Administration. I don't know why this is going. I'm so sorry. It seems to be getting ahead of itself. It includes the Veterans Administration, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the National Science Foundation. It's important to note that the definitions of animals in the PHS policy is not the commonly used definition of animal. It's a legal definition. So for the purposes of the PHS policy, the term animal means any live vertebrate animal used or intended for use in research, research training, experimentation, or biological testing, or for related purposes. This means that invertebrates are not covered by the policy, nor are animals used for other purposes than those described in the definition. And however, there are some activities that constitute covered animal use that may not seem very obvious. For example, any animals euthanized for study-related purposes, such as tissue harvest, and animals that received study-related antemortem manipulation before euthanasia. For example, if you're giving animals a special diet before euthanasia for tissue harvest, and the diet is only given because the study requires it, these are covered activities. Generation of custom monoclonal antibodies at the request of the investigator is also considered live animal use because live animals are required to make the antibodies that are being specifically requested for the study. However, antibodies from vendors that are generally available for purchase and not a custom request are not considered live animal use, and neither are animals that are euthanized for unrelated purposes. An example of this last one would be animals that are slaughtered for food, where some tissues are used for the study, or tissues are purchased that are generally available from vendors and do not constitute a custom request. So what does NIH require when live vertebrate animals are used for NIH-supported research? Well, there are two broad categories of requirements. There are requirements for grant applications as well as contract proposals that must be addressed by the investigator, and these include the vertebrate animals section as well as other animal-related requirements. This is part of the application, so this must be done early on in the process. There are also requirements for the institution. Institutions must have an approved animal welfare assurance, and I'll talk about that in these next slides. But first, let's talk about the vertebrate animals section. And this provides specific information on the animal portions of the research for all grant applications or contract proposals involving live vertebrate animals as defined in the PHS policy. For this talk, I'll focus more on grant applications, but please be aware that these requirements apply to any contract proposals as well. The vertebrate animals section has 3 criteria that must be completed. One is the description of procedures, which comprises a concise description of the proposed animal procedures and must include the species, strains, ages, sex, and total number of animals by species to be used. And if dogs or cats are proposed, the source of these animals must also be provided. Justifications for the proposed animal work is the second section, and in this section, the investigator must explain why the species are appropriate for the proposed research, and also why the research goals cannot be accomplished using an alternative model, for example, computational models, human, invertebrate, or in vitro models. And the last section is the minimization of pain and distress. And this is probably the most important section. In this section, the investigator describes the circumstances relevant to the proposed work where animals might experience discomfort, distress, pain, or injury, and any interventions that they'll be using to minimize that pain or distress. In addition to the VAS, there are several other animal-related requirements. These include the rationales for choosing the strains, ages, sex, and numbers of animals by species, and that would be included in the research strategy section of a grant application. It also includes euthanasia information, which for grants is found in the 398 cover page supplement or PHS fellowship supplemental form. And it also requires the identification and provision of all required information for all animal performance sites. And in other words, what that means is all of the information covered in the slides need to be provided for all the sites where the animal work is being performed. And the information associated with each performance site needs to be clearly identified so we understand what's being done at each site. Now that we've discussed investigator responsibilities, let's talk about institutional responsibilities. Research institutions with grantees need to have an animal welfare assurance, which is an agreement with NIH negotiated through OLA. And that's OLA stands for the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare. It describes how the institution meets the animal welfare requirements outlined in the PHS policy by providing details of its animal care and use program. In other words, it describes the animal care and use program that the institution commits to follow. And the requirement for an animal welfare assurance applies both within and outside of the United States. There are different kinds of assurances, so I'll go through this quickly. You will see that there are URLs on these slides, so you can go back and read more if any of this is of interest. So domestic assurances are for U.S. institutions that conduct live vertebrate animal work on site, that control their own animal facilities, and that have an animal care and use program with an institutional official. And for the purposes of the PHS policy, the institutional official allocates resources for the animal program. An institutional animal care and use committee, which we shorten to IACUC, and that is the committee that reviews all animal activities, and it requires IACUC approval before these activities can begin. And there's also a requirement for a veterinarian with program authority and access to all of the animals. Interinstitutional assurances are for domestic or foreign assurances that do not have their own animal care and use programs, do not have facilities to house animals, don't have an IACUC, or don't conduct animal research on site for PHS-funded live vertebrate animal work. And such institutions perform the animal activity at a secondary assured institution that is named as the performance site. And finally, foreign assurances are for institutions outside of the US that serve as animal performance sites where PHS-funded live vertebrate animal work is conducted, and that control their own animal facilities, conduct research on site, and have an animal care and use program with an authorized signing official. The assurance requirements apply equally to institutions that are primary awardees and those that receive indirect funding as a performance site for a primary awardee. And assurances will be requested of any foreign organizations that are animal performance sites. So the NIH begins the process of negotiating the assurance. And for foreign assurances, there are three broad requirements: compliance with the PHS policy or provision of evidence that acceptable standards for the humane care and use of animals will be met. So either of those are acceptable. Compliance with all applicable laws, regulations, and policies governing animal care and use for their country of jurisdiction. And finally, institutional commitment to the international guiding principles for biomedical research involving animals. And I will go briefly into this last requirement, but you will hear more about it later in the webinar. These are a really helpful framework for thinking about research in animal welfare and have a lot of similarities to the US government principles that I discussed earlier. So I really suggest you look at those. They are a wonderful framework for thinking about animal welfare. So just a little bit about the international guiding principles. There are 10 principles that harmonize with guidance from other national and international agencies. They cover things like decision-making for animal use, and considerations should include scientific knowledge, professional judgment, and ethical and societal values, as well as potential benefits and impacts on the well-being of the animals involved, as well as moral obligations and responsibilities for institutions and individuals to ensure welfare. They also talk about use of animals only when necessary and with implementation of the 3 R's, which are replacement, reduction, and refinement. It talks about animal selection with the concept that animal choice should be suitable for the purpose. And it talks about the program of veterinary care with the health and welfare of its animals as the primary consideration. And this includes acquisition, animal production, transportation, husbandry and management, housing and restraint, and final disposition of the animals. It also recommends management that is tailored to the species being used. It also covers welfare, care, and use of animals, and requires supervision of a veterinarian or scientist trained and experienced in the health, welfare, proper handling, and use of the species. It requires consideration of pain and distress, and for this, they specify that investigators should assume that procedures that would cause pain or distress in human beings cause pain or distress in animals unless there is evidence to the contrary. And the US government principles say something very similar. And this is very important. It also talks about endpoints, timely intervention, and study removal for both humane and experimental reasons, the training and qualification of personnel as an institutional responsibility, systems of animal use oversight, authorization and oversight, including ethical review and harm-benefit analysis. And to be clear, those are the duties of the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. When they are evaluating a protocol, they should be looking at the harm-benefit analysis according to these principles and authorizing the use of the animals for the study after they've determined that it meets welfare requirements. It also talks about animal care and welfare implementation, using each of the principles I've just discussed, and record keeping. And together they provide pretty good coverage of all of the elements of a comprehensive research animal care and use program. This is a screenshot of the foreign assurance form. You can see that it asks about applicability. So that means which parts of the institution are covered by the Public Health Service. It also requests commitment to the international guiding principles and asks for a list of any laws, regulations, and policies governing the care and use of animals that apply to the institution. And it has a section on compliance that requests reporting of any serious or continuing non-compliances with the assurance, as well as any reports of suspension. The form also asks for a brief definition of oversight, a description of oversight, and the institution agrees to notify OLA of any changes to their contact information. And then the next section discusses annual reporting requirements to OLA, with the last section including institutional contacts and endorsements. And if you ever need help filling out these forms, you can always contact OLA for assistance. Here's where you can find information on OLA resources on the web. I've included links for laws, policies, guidance, and educational resources, as well as some popular links to find information on specific topics quickly. And for these, I recommend the frequently asked questions, or FAQs. They address a lot of questions that people ask, and it's a great way to find information quickly. They're divided up into categories, so you can find them very easily based on those designations. And so I hope that in this talk, we've been able to increase your understanding of the requirements for NIH-supported research for investigators and for institutions. And I provided some information to help you find out more about what's available on our OLA website. And you can look up what we discussed today. And thank you. And I'm happy to take questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Nicolette. It's been extremely helpful, and I know that many people already are requesting the links to some of the resources that you shared. So it'd be great if later you could copy and paste them on the chat, because I think some people are trying to take pictures and it got a little bit quick and they cannot copy them from your slide.
Certainly. And if
uh,
you'd like a PDF, I can provide a PDF to distribute as well, if that's something that would be helpful.
Oh, well, that'd be great. And we could send that. We can send it when we share the recording to with the participants. So we are still having. We have another panelist, Dr. Ekaterina Botovchenko Rivera, and she's been having problems to connect. So I think what we can do is we'll start with some questions for you. So and my colleague Sara Carracedo was going to moderate that, and we do have questions on top of requests for
Sure.
the links. And I'm happy to introduce to you Sara Carracedo, who most of you know in the region. Sara Carracedo works at Bajo's regional program on bioethics. Adelante, Sara.
Gracias, Carla. Gracias,
Thank you,
Nicolette, por
Carla.
la presentación.
Thank you, Nicolette,
Hay
for your presentation.
algunas preguntas, así que
That we
creo
have some
que,
questions in the chat,
podemos
so
empezar con,
we'll start
aquellas
with
relacionadas con las
the ones
regulaciones
that have to
que
do
nos
with
has presentado sobre el
regulations
NIH.
that you've described, the
Estas
regulations at NIH.
regulaciones, estos
These
requisitos se aplican solamente
requirements,
a la
do they
investigación que es
apply only
financiada
to
por el
research
NIH?
financed
¿Qué
by
pasa con las
NIH?
investigaciones
What happens to
que no son
research that
financiadas
is
por
not
los
financed
institutos
or
nacionales de
funded
salud?
by the National Institute of Health?
Okay, I apologize. I'm looking for the translation. Okay, I just did this now. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Sí, claro. La pregunta
Yes,
es
the question is
sobre las regulaciones y
on
requisitos que nos has
regulations and the
presentado.
regulations and
Muchos de
requirements that
ellos,
you
o
presented.
en general,
Many
queda la
of
duda
these,
si es que estos solamente se aplican para la
the
investigación
question
que se
is,
realiza
does this
en
apply
el NIH
only
o
to
financiada por el
funding,
NIH, o si se aplica a todo
to
el país,
research funded by
todas las
NIH, or
investigaciones
does it
con
apply to
animales.
all
En caso que no sea
research
así, ¿cómo se
involving
regulan
animals?
estas
And
investigaciones que
if
están por
that
fuera
is not the
de
case,
los
then how do
institutos
you
nacionales de
regulate
salud?
research that is done outside NIH?
So our requirements apply to work that is supported by the Public Health Service, and that includes all of those government institutions, and support can be monetary or non-monetary. And it also includes those other agencies that I mentioned that have a memorandum of understanding. It does not include all research, but once again, we can't really impose values on other countries. So what we do is we ask for these things for applications for NIH support and for PHS support. The Animal Welfare Act and its regulations applies to the United States and its territories. So one of the things you noted in our in that screenshot of the application, the assurance application that I showed, was it asks for local laws and requirements. We ask you to list all of the applicable laws and requirements in your home country. Does that help answer the question?
Sí, perfecto. Muchísimas gracias.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you very much.
Me parece que nuestra otra
I think that our
panelista
other
ya ha podido
panelist
conectarse.
has been
Entonces,
able to
Carla, te
connect
dejo para que la
now.
presentes
So,
y luego
Carlo, I
pasamos a
will
las preguntas
give
al
you the
final.
floor so that you can introduce her, and then we'll
Sara. Muchas
do
gracias,
questions at the end.
Nicolette.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Ahora
Thank you very
tenemos
much,
el
Nicolette.
gusto de
We now
tener
have
a la
the
doctora
pleasure of
Ekaterina
having
Botovchenko
Dr.
Rivera,
Ekaterina
que es
Botovchenko
veterinaria y
Rivera,
tiene un doctorado
who's a
en
veterinarian and
ciencias
has
de
a
animales
doctorate
con laboratorio,
in laboratory
y su
animal
énfasis
sciences,
es en
and her
ética,
focus is
legislación y
on
bienestar
ethics,
animal de
legislation,
los
and animal
animales de
welfare
laboratorio.
for lab
Ella es
animals.
miembro ad hoc
She is an ad hoc
del
member
grupo de
of
bienestar de los
the
animales de laboratorio de
group on the welfare of
de la
laboratory
Organización
animals
Mundial
of the World Health
Salud Animal
Organization,
y
World
ha
Animal Health
contribuido, trabajado
Organization,
mucho
and she
en
has
este tema.
contributed a
Vamos
lot
a
and
darle
worked, done a
paso
lot
a
of
la,
research in this
a la
area.
doctora
So I will now call on
Rivera,
Dr.
mientras que ella se
Rivera,
conecta. Doctora Rivera,
and
si
while
me
she
prende,
connects,
ahora está su cámara y su
there, she's got her
micro.
camera on now. Could you please turn your
Entonces,
microphone on,
le
Dr.
le
Rivera?
doy la palabra,
And
le
I
doy la
will
palabra entonces,
call
doctora.
on you. Go ahead, Dr. Rivera.
Necesitamos
Her
que,
microphone
que
is
abra
not
su
on.
micro.
Ok.
Ahora sí, gracias.
Sí.
Adelante.
Now we hear
Bienvenida.
you.
Voy a ver si consigo poner la tela, por favor, voy a ver aquí.
Let me see if I can put my screen on. There.
Vemos la presentación, pero podría
We can
ponerla en modo
see the
presentación
presentation, but
para
could you
poder
put
verla
it in
mejor, por favor.
presentation mode so that we can
Estoy
see it
buscando
better?
acá hacerlo.
I'm trying to find
La
where to
copita,
do it.
ahí.
It's yes,
Sí,
down.
ya está. Ok.
Perfecto,
Ah,
gracias.
Buenas tardes. Disculpen por el
Good
trastorno que tuve
afternoon,
un problema
and
que
my
se fue la luz
apologies
acá
for the
y
problem
entonces
we
tuve
had.
ese problema
I
para
lost my
buscar
electricity,
y
so I had this
me gustaría mucho
problem.
agradecer a Carla y
And
a
I'd like to
Sara
thank
por
Carla
la
and Sarah
invitación que
for
me han hecho
having extended this
y para
invitation
hablar
to
de un
me
tema tan
to
importante como
speak about
sea,
such an
cual sea el
important
panorama
topic as
regulatorio
the
en América
uh,
Latina. Antes de empezar, permítame
regulation of
hacer una mención a la
the care
doctora
and use of
Adela Rosenkranz, que ha
animals
sido una
in
asesora
Latin
por
America.
muchos
First of
años
all,
de
I'd like to
OPAS en
thank
la cuestión de
Dr.
ciencia de
Adela
animales de laboratorio
Rosenkratz, who has been
y trabajó mucho
done
para
a
que
lot of work at the Pan
capacitar a las
American Health
personas que
Organization on
trabajan en
animal
esa área
welfare
y
and has done a
también
lot to train people
mejores
who work in that
instalaciones
area
para los animales
and
de
to
laboratorio.
ensure that there are
Dicho
better
eso, me
facilities for
gustaría
laboratory animals.
empezar
Having
hablando
said
de
that,
lo.
let me now
Primero digo que voy a ser algo bastante general para darles un
say that what
panorama de
I'm
cómo
going to
estamos
talk
en
about is fairly
Latinoamérica
general, just
y
an
espero que
overview of
después
the
de eso
situation in
haya
Latin America. And
participación de
after
otras
that, I hope
personas que puedan
to have the
agregar
participation of other people who
más
will be able to
informaciones
add
acerca
more
del tema.
information on the
Vamos a
topic.
empezar por el obvio, que
Let's
América
begin
Latina es un
with the
continente multicultural,
obvious fact
tiene
that Latin
diferentes
America is a
niveles económicos,
multicultural
educacionales.
continent. It has
¿Por qué
many
digo eso?
different
Porque el
economic
desarrollo de la
and
ciencia pasa lo
educational
mismo.
levels. And
Hay
why do I
a
say this?
veces en el
Because the
propio país
development
de
of
uno hay
science
regiones.
applies in
Perdón,
the same way.
Ekaterina,
My
un momentito.
apologies,
Algunas
Ekaterina.
personas están
Some
teniendo
people are
problemas.
having
Recuerden, por
problems.
favor, que
Please
si pusieron en inglés, escucharán
remember
en
that
inglés.
if you
Tienen que volver a
selected
seleccionar
English, you have to
si
listen
quieren
in English. If you
escuchar en
prefer to
español,
hear
dice
in Spanish, you
pueden
have to
escoger en español
select Spanish
o el audio original. Y
and
recuerden cuando escogen un canal, apretar
remember that if you choose a channel,
apagar
a
el audio
Spanish or
original
English,
si es que se
turn
está
off
escuchando la
original
traducción.
audio, otherwise you'll hear the original speaker in the very
¿Puede
background.
seguir? Ok.
May I go ahead?
Entonces, el
So
desarrollo de la ciencia en
the
nuestros países
the
no es
development of
igual.
science in our
Hay una
countries
gran
is not
diferencia, diferentes
even. There's a lot of
niveles, pero a
difference in
medida
many
que
different levels.
empezamos a trabajar
But
más
as we
en el
begin
área de las
to
ciencias
work
de animales de
more in the
laboratorio,
area of
profesionales
uh,
más capacitados
lab
en el área,
animals,
podemos sentir que
then
necesitamos de
we
normas, reglamentos
feel
para que
now that we need
nuestras,
rules and regulations so that
nuestras investigaciones
our
que
own
utilizan animales
researchers who
sean
use
de mejor
animals
calidad y que
uh,
sigamos las normas
have the highest
internacionales y que estemos
international
en armonía
standards
con
and
otros
quality,
países del
and
mundo.
to ensure that
¿Y
we
por
are
qué digo
in
eso? Que
harmony with other
desearíamos
countries in
mucho
the
tener
world.
una ley
Why
para
do I say
todos,
this?
que fuera una ley
It would be
común para
great to
América
have one
Latina,
common law
pero
for
yo miro
everyone,
muy
for all of
difícil,
Latin America,
aún
but I see
ahora
that as
es muy
being very
difícil una ley
difficult.
común.
because there's so many different countries that have different types of legislation, different ways that legislate. The governments have different priorities. Maybe it's an unstable government, or maybe there's economic problems, or there's a lack of infrastructure. So most governments are may not be sensitive to this request that we need to have better conditions or a law to regulate the use of laboratory animals. Maybe they're not interested in that, and so we have to work harder on bringing this to their attention. But yes, we do need legislation. We need it because we don't all think in the same way. If we had the same values, all of us, we would not need legislative sanctions because they would occur naturally. But that's not what happened. So I'm going to put in big letters that uh, animal experiments or use of animals in experiments requires major ethical content. That's why it has to be subject to restriction, and that legislation is the only effective means of monitoring and controlling that. Now, if we want to draft laws, and I know many of you are already working on this, there are already some draft bills or others are before the National Congress for approval. We must acknowledge, however, that this is not easy to do, and it's not easy to codify and transcribe into a document very complex clinical procedures, clinical trials, animal behavior, multiple surgeries, and mainly keep in mind that the law has to be short, succinct. It cannot go into too many details because to explain the law, that is done in the annexes and the regulatory standards. As an example, let me say that the law states that we have to have an ethics committee in each higher education institution. That's all it says. Now, as to how it works, how you implement it, who the members are, all those details appear only in the annexes or in the regulatory resolutions. So a draft bill cannot be drafted only by scientists and researchers. You need to include legislators, jurists who have extensive knowledge. Otherwise, it's impossible to implement these laws. And there's a big problem in drafting laws involving laboratory animals. And the reason it's difficult is because the science is continuously changing. What is the law today can be surpassed by tomorrow. So that's, for instance, in our law, we already have some articles that are already outdated. We're going to have to update them, and that's not easy to do. So we only should draft laws that we can actually implement, and they should be followed, even though you may not fully agree with them. Why do I say this? Because it's very important that we, in our work, it usually takes place in enclosed places, laboratories and research halls. So we don't have cameras or inspectors 24 days, hours a day, seeing what we're doing and seeing whether we're following the law or not. So that's why we have to draw attention to individuals to ensure that the law is followed and implemented. Now, why have I listed here the international principle of the SIAMS of the which together with ICLAS, the International Council of Laboratory Animal Sciences, that and these principles were updated in 2010 because at the very beginning, uh, let me just compare this to what we have done in Brazil. At the beginning, we had nothing, we had no laws. And so we started to use the SIAMS principles and to how you, the ICLAS principles on how you do research and how you have the ethical use of animals, how do you ensure the welfare of animals. And then using those principles, those ICLAS principles, we found out that what we were doing with animals should be a privilege given to us by society, and that this privilege must be translated into moral obligations and responsibilities, both for the individual and the institutions. And we also needed to ensure in order to have the
Pero
best
eso por
welfare for
mucho
the
tiempo
animals, we had
nosotros
to
tuvimos
have
pegados
good
en las puertas
scientific
de
data.
esos bioterios, no
But
todo el mundo, eso no era
we
obligatorio,
had
pero muchos ya
put
tenían
pasted up on
los principios
doors of our
internacionales. Yo
laboratories
creo que fue el
the
primer paso
international
que dimos
principles. So that was perhaps the first
rumbo
step
a una
we
mejor
took
investigación con
as
animales
we moved
experimentación.
towards better
Pero eso no era
treatment of
suficiente y
laboratory animals. But
conocimos
that was
en
not
un
enough to
congreso
post
al
these
doctor Gilles Demers, que era
class guidelines.
presidente de
And in
ICLES
at a
para
congress,
en
we
la
met
época,
Dr. GMS,
que
who's
vino a ese
the
congreso y hablando que
president
no
of ICLES
teníamos
at the
nada, él
time.
me dijo, ¿y
And
por
we
qué no
told him we
empieza
didn't
como
have
nosotros
anything.
tenemos
And
en
he said,
Canadá
why don't
por
you start the
comisiones
way we did
médicas?
in
Nos pareció muy
Canada with
interesante y él nos dio
ethics
gran
committees. And
orientación,
we
nos
thought
dio,
that was a
trajo
good idea.
material y
He
dedicó
provided a lot of
mucho tiempo
information, a lot
para
of
ayudarnos
material
a
to us
montar esas
to help
comisiones
us
de ética,
set
esos
up
comités de
these
ética, como
research ethics
quisiéramos
committees.
llamados. Y también tuvimos el
And
auxilio del Dr. Brian
we
Howard
also
de
had the
Inglaterra
assistance
y
of
ahí empezamos
Brian
entonces
Howard from England.
a montar
And
algunas
so we started
comisiones de
to
ética en algunas
set up
universidades y al poco
some
tiempo
research
habían
ethics
várias
committees at the
instituições
various
que tinham
universities.
seus
And
comitês de ética,
gradually,
que
we
não
had
era
several
obrigatório
institutions that
porque não
had
era
ethics committees.
lei,
It
mas
wasn't
as pessoas
binding because
sentiam
there
o
was no
recomeço,
law, but
poderiam
people felt
também,
that with this
quizás
uh,
pressionadas por querer
regulations, they could
publicar em revistas de excelência
uh,
internacionais, também não
publish
podiam
in
ser assim seus
international
trabalhos não passavam
magazines,
por um comitê
and
de
they
ética. Teníamos
felt they
comitês de
couldn't do
ética
that had
já
it,
para o
their
uso
work
de
not
animais,
gone through an ethics
junto com
committee.
o comitê de,
We, we
uso
had
de
an
humanos,
ethics committee
então o
on the
comitê
use of
de
animals and
investigação
as
com
well as
humanos.
humans in
Pero
research,
entonces ahí
but
apartamos y quedamos solo
we
con
now
comités de ética para el uso de
focused
animales,
only on an
investigación.
ethics committee
Y entonces,
for
como pueden ver, eso
laboratory
fue una
animals. As you
alternativa
could
a una
see,
legislación
this was
inexistente.
an
Aquí
alternative
pongo
to the fact
ceros y
that there
cuadros
was no
porque son
legislation
diferentes
that
nombres
existed.
que tenemos de
Here,
los comités de
we
ética
have
en América Latina.
the
En
names of
algunos
various ethics
países, por
committees
ejemplo,
in Latin America. In
Brasil,
some countries, like in Brazil,
los comités de éticas
the ethics
son medios de implementar la
committees
legislación que tenemos vigente. Son
are the ones
esenciales
that
para
helped
empezar a
implement the
tener una
existing
visión
legislation.
de lo que
So
se
it is
puede y no se
important
puede hacer
to
en
have an
experimentación
ethics
animal.
committee to determine
Y
what
el
can
papel
and
de la
cannot be
comisión
done
de
in
ética,
animal
cuál
research.
es?
Now, what is
No
the
es solamente
role of an
evaluar los
ethics
protocolos de
committee?
investigación
Not
para que
just to
puedan
evaluate
publicar
the research
en buenos
protocols so that you
periódicos.
can
La
publish in
finalidad es enriquecer la
distinguished
forma de
journals. The
actuar de los
purpose is
investigadores
actually
y
to
de los que
enrich the
trabajan con
way
animales
that
también, los que
researchers
crían a los
work and
animales,
act,
los
the ones
que
who work with animals,
en los bioterios,
who
para ayudar
raise them,
a pensar
and
mejor
to
y
help them
modificar sus
think better
actitudes,
and
porque
change their
cargamos
attitudes, because
un trabajo de muchos y muchos años de
we've
hacer de cierta
spent
forma
many
un
years
procedimiento cuando
using
actualmente
a
eso no se puede
certain
hacer.
procedure which may not
Entonces,
be
modificar
allowed
las
today. So
actitudes de los
to change
investigadores,
behavior of the
cualquier
researchers
usuario de animales
or any
utilizados
person
en
who
investigación.
uses laboratory
Entonces,
animals is
después que
important.
empezamos a utilizar
So after we
las comisiones de
began
éticas,
uh, to set
nos
up
dimos
these
cuenta que empezamos a usar las tres
research ethics
R's. Las
committees,
tres R's, como
we
van,
realized that we had to
van a
start
ver,
using the
es
three
el
R's,
principio de toda
which
legislación
is
que
the
existe en el
basis
mundo
of
en el área de
any
los servicios de
legislation
animales de
worldwide. These
laboratorio.
three R's are
Las tres
used in
R's son,
all
que son
the
todos deben
guidelines for
conocer que
animals.
debemos
These
siempre
three R's
utilizar
is some that
alternativa
you're
al uso de
familiar with,
animales,
which should
buscar
always,
no
for instance,
utilizar
use
sí,
replacement
alternativas
for the
a los
use of an
animales,
animal,
utilizar el
try
menor
to see if we
número
could use
posible de
something else,
animales
a
y
reduction to
también
use the
buscar
lowest
no causar
number of
sufrimiento y
animals,
dolor a
and
los animales
refinement, in
empleados
other words,
en
not cause
investigación.
pain or
Entonces,
suffering
las
in
comisiones
or
de ética
distress in
nos
research
ayudaron a tomar
animals. So
conciencia
the
de
ethics
cómo
committees
conducir una
may
investigación
helped
con
us
ética, pensando en el
understand
bienestar
how should
animal
we
y los
carry out
datos
ethical research
científicos,
using
porque
animals and
sabemos
using the best
que el
scientific data,
estrés de
because we
investigar en
know
los animales
that
nos
distress in
acarretan datos
animals
científicos inválidos. Y
can
ahí
produce
sí podíamos
invalid
publicar con los
scientific
mejores
research.
periódicos,
And
pero lo que sí pudimos hacer
this
es
allowed us to
desarrollar
publish
una
in
cultura de
the
cuidado.
distinguished
Cuando
journals,
tuvimos la
and it
ley
also helped us
empezó a
develop a culture of
existir,
care.
que
Then,
tuvimos las
when we
comisiones de
started
ética, fue
to
muy
draft
fácil para
the
nosotros
law,
porque ya habíamos
it,
caminado
it was easier
un
for us
largo
because
camino
we had
utilizando
the research
los comités
ethics
de ética.
committees
Aquí
in
voy a dejar
existence
entonces
already, and we had
el
already done a
panorama
lot of
que
the
tenemos.
groundwork.
Tenemos tres países
This
que
is our
poseen
situation in Latin America now.
leyes
We have three
específicas, que son
countries that have
Brasil,
specific
México y
laws
Uruguay.
on animal
Las
use:
leyes
Brazil,
son muy
Mexico, and
semejantes,
Uruguay.
surgieron
Very
como
similar
casi
laws.
en el mismo
they came up but
¿verdad?
around the
Y el
same time
principio
frame.
de
And
estas
the
leyes son
principles
las tres
behind
R's,
these
como
laws are the
respetar
three
leyes.
R's,
Aquí
as
les
I
pongo
mentioned
de la
earlier.
ley brasileña
The
que está bien clara,
here's the
alternativas en el
Brazilian
texto,
law
elevado
that
número
is
de
very
animales
clear. You have
posible,
to replace
utilizar el
animals,
analgesia o
the
anestesia,
lowest number of animals,
principalmente visando el
and use
bienestar
sedatives,
animal. ¿Y a
analgesics, or
quién se
anesthesia
aplica
in any
esa ley? A
in
los
any experiment to
vertebrados,
diminish
excepto
distress.
el hombre.
Uh,
Y si alguien
the
está
scope and
empezando a elaborar
applicability
un
is all
proyecto de
animals
ley
in
que
education and
todavía no ha
research.
aprobado,
And if the country has
acuérdense
not yet
que hay
approved a
vertebrados que
law,
deberían constar de la ley,
keep in
pero
mind
no
that there
constan
are
en
some
nuestras leyes, que son
vertebrates
los
that are
cefalópodos, que
covered
constan de
by the
varias
law. These
leyes
are the
en el mundo porque son
cephalopods
muy
that are covered by
sensibles
many laws
y incluso en la
worldwide
ley de
because they're
Tailandia ya
very
tenemos
sensitive.
decápodos y
And
artrópodos que son
we
protegidos
also
por ley
have
también.
decapodes and
Y
arthropods
en
covered by our
todas
law
las
as
leyes
well.
que
In
tenemos
all the
siempre hay
laws,
un órgano superior,
there's
es decir,
always
que
a
hace que
governing
la ley sea
body that
cumplida,
ensures that
que
the
en
law
Brasil
is
se llama
applied. In
CONSEA,
Brazil,
Consejo Nacional
that
de Control
governing
de la
body is called CONSEA, the
Experimentación
National Council
Animal,
for
que
Monitoring
es
of
el
Animal
presidente, es el
Experimentation,
ministro del Consejo
and the head is the
de la Ciencia y Tecnología,
Minister of Science and
¿sí? Y
Technology.
puse solo algunas
And
competencias
I
porque el tiempo
listed
no
just
nos
some
da
of
para hablar de
the
todo, solamente que es muy importante que
issues
las normas sean
included.
cumplidas y
But
que
what some of
toda
the points are,
institución
is very
posee una
important
CEOA
that
y
standards
toda
are
cualquier
met,
institución en Brasil que
and that they
utilice
use
animales
ethics and
en
humanitarian
experimentación o enseñanza
things with
tiene que
animals.
estar registrada
The
en el CONSEA.
the any
Entonces
institution
aquí,
that
perdón, pero no sé por qué en estos
provides
slides el
experiments in
nombre
animals
Argentina y Belice
must be a member of
salieron de foco,
CONSEA.
pero aquí les voy a presentar los
Here
países
are some
de
of the
América
countries
Latina, qué es
now
lo
in
que
Latin
tienen.
America,
Por ejemplo,
and
Argentina y
what they
Colombia
have.
trabajan
For
muy
instance,
bien
Argentina and
con
Colombia function very
comités de
well
ética, no
with
tienen
ethics
ley
committees, the research
específica,
ethics committee. They
pero
don't
ya
have a
tienen
specific
proyectos de
law
ley, los otros
governing it,
países que
although
quieren
there
buscando
is
pasar
a
por el Congreso.
draft bill that they're
Colombia la
trying
ley
to get
federal,
Colombia to accept, to the
que
Congress
también
to
es una
accept.
ley de
Colombia has a
protección
federal
de
law
los animales
for the
y
protection
hay
of
algunos
animals,
artículos
and there
que
are
hablan del
some
uso de animales
articles
en
that talk about
experimentación
the use
y a
of
las
animals
universidades
in experiments.
buscan
And
seguir esa
in
ley,
Colombia, universities
pero
apply that
no
law.
todos
They
lo
try to
siguen, no
apply it,
todo
but
el
not
país lo sigue.
everyone
Hay lo
does.
mismo en
The
Argentina
same
también,
applies in
esa
Argentina.
ley ya desde
They've
2012
had
está
a law in place
en
since
el Congreso, apenas
2012.
están
It's
revisando
been
una ley
before the
nueva
Congress, but it's
y
being
Bolivia
revised
está
once again.
apenas empezando
Bolivia is
con el
just
área de
starting
animales de
to
laboratorio,
draft
tiene
a
dos
bill
borradores de proyectos de
on
ley,
laboratory
no hay
animals. They
algo
have two
específico,
drafts
tampoco
before the
tengo
Congress, but
ninguna
there's no
noticia
specific law yet in
de
place.
secuales.
And I haven't
Y
received
aquí
any
cito en
information
Belice hay un caso
from
muy
Sequal.
interesante
And then
porque
Belize is an
allá el
interesting
ministro
case
puede dar una
because
licencia
in
para cualquier
Belize,
persona
you
para hacer
can give
cualquier
a
experimento
license to
y
anybody to
para
do
cualquier
any
ciencia
experiment.
muy
And
interesante porque,
that's
digamos, cualquier
interesting
uno hace lo
concept
que
because
quiere,
anybody can do what
así
they
me
want.
parece que
At least
quedó
that's what it
la ley.
seems like.
Y aquí tenemos
Uh,
Chile, Cuba,
and
Costa
then we have
Rica, los
Chile,
tres tienen también
Cuba,
ley de
Costa
protección
Rica,
animal,
who
ley de
all three
bienestar
have
animal, como se quiera
laws
llamar,
to
es lo
protect
mismo.
animals,
Y todos
uh,
trabajan con cicuales,
and they all work
muy
with
importante los cicuales en Chile, en
the
Costa Rica. En
Ayacuk.
Costa Rica
The
también tiene
Ayacuks in Chile
un
and
decreto del
Costa
Ministerio
Rica
de
are
Ciencia y
quite effective. In
Tecnología
Costa
que
Rica,
se
they have a
aplica a los
law
animales
on
de experimentación,
technology that
pero también
applies
es una
to
cosa que todo el
laboratory
país
animals,
lo siga, más las universidades.
but
Chile
not
está muy bien
all
con la cuestión
country
de los
follows it.
cicuales,
Chile
pero también
has
espera
some Yakuks
para
set up,
hacer con eso ley
but
específica.
it's
Cuba
working
también
on developing a
hizo
specific
la Guía
law.
Nacional
Cuba has a
con
national
el modelo de la Guía
guidelines
Nacional Americana,
following
que
the
se basa
American
en
guideline,
the Guide for
which
the
is
Care and Use
based
of
on the
Laboratory
Guide for
Animals.
the Care and Use of
Ecuador
Laboratory Animals.
sigue,
And
no
then
sigue ley,
Ecuador
tiene ley, sigue los
doesn't have
principios
a
de la
specific
Organización
law, but it
Mundial
does
de
follow
la
the
Salud Animal,
principles
que en su
of the
capítulo
World
7.8 del
Health
Código
Animal
Terrestre
World
es
Animal Health
específico para el
Organization,
uso de
and it
animales, son
follows
recomendaciones
specifically
para el
Chapter
uso de animales en
7.8
investigación
on the use
y
of
enseñanza.
research
Aquí
animals.
El Salvador
In El
y
Salvador
Guatemala poco tienen,
and
poco están
Guatemala,
empezando a trabajar
they
con
have
eso. Son muy
very
jóvenes,
little.
digamos,
They're
en el área de
still
ciencia de
young
animales de
in the area of
laboratorio.
laboratory
Tienen una
animal
ley en El
sciences.
Salvador de
El
bienestar animal,
Salvador
pero no
has a law on
necesita
animal
nada más para
welfare
animales de laboratorio.
but
no
this
tienen
does
secuales
say
todavía.
anything
No
specifically
tengo
about
datos de Guyana
lab
Francesa,
animals. They don't have
sabemos
any
si alguien
yakuk.
puede acrescentar algo
I don't
en
have
eso.
anything about French
Guatemala tiene
Guyana,
un
if anybody
reglamento
can
interno, pero
inform
se
us on
aplica
that.
solamente a la
And
Universidad de San
Guatemala
Carlos,
has
¿verdad? Y tiene que
only a
tener
regulation that
secual, y
applies
una
in the
otra
University of San
universidad está
Carlos.
pensando también
And
a
there
formar sus
some
secuales,
other
pero no
universities, they're
tienen ley
starting to set up
específica.
their own
Vamos por
yakuk, but
Honduras,
not specifically.
Nicaragua,
And then we have Honduras
que
and
tienen
Nicaragua
leyes también de
that
protección
have
animal, bien como
laws
Panamá.
to protect
Tiene, cada uno tiene
animal
una sección
welfare.
que habla de alguna
And
cosa
Panama
que no, no
has a
lleva
section that protects
de
animal
no
welfare,
provocar malos tratos a los
and that
animales
you shouldn't mistreat
que usados en pesquisa,
animals
investigación,
used in research.
pero
But
nada específico
there's
tampoco,
nothing
nada del
specific,
secual.
nothing
Y
about
Panamá sí ya tiene
yakuk.
secuales muy
And
actuales.
Panama,
Panamá se ha puesto últimamente muy
that was in
fuerte
Nicaragua.
buscando
Panama
ley,
has
buscando
t-
hacer
worked
reuniones
hard in
acerca
trying
de
to
la
draft the
cuestión
bill.
de
They're
los
having a
animales
lot
de
of meetings
investigación
on
secuales.
how to treat
Paraguay está
research
haciendo
animals
ese
in their
proceso,
country, and they
tuvimos
do
una reunión
have
con
a
Paraguay
yakuk.
buscando
And
hacer una parte de
Paraguay
ley y se fue
is
incluso
in the midst
tres
of drafting a
locales
bill, and they
solamente,
have a yakuk
no
in two
está
or three
todavía
places
muy bien
only,
formado.
not
¿Y qué
too
tenemos en
much
Perú?
information on that. Now,
En
what's happening
Venezuela
in
también,
Peru
ley de
and
protección de los
Venezuela? They
animales,
do
lo
have a
mismo
law to
con
protect
párrafos
animals,
citando, pero
uh,
nada específico.
but nothing
Perú y
specific.
Venezuela trabajan muy bien con los secuales también.
But they do
República
have
Dominicana también. Suriname no
yakuks
tengo
and
datos sobre de ellos.
Suriname, I don't have
Aquí,
any
así
data.
entonces
And
le he
the
puesto
Dominican
los
Republic just
países
has
que
a
tienen
yakuk.
algo para
So
que
I've
ustedes vean
listed
que
the
todos
countries and tell
empezaron con
you
los
what
secuales
they have so
por
you can see
saber
they're
que
all
tramitaron
starting
una
by
ley
setting
en
up an
Congreso
institution
Nacional
animal care and use
CECIO,
committee,
pero que están muy
and
preocupados en conducir sus
they are
investigaciones de una
interested
forma
in
ética y
doing
buscando el
research
bienestar
in
de los
an
animales. Y
ethical
eso sí se
manner
puede sentir
and
en
in the
toda
proper welfare of
Latinoamérica.
animals. We
¿Y
do
quién
sense
ayuda
that is
mucho
occurring in
a
all
que
of
eso
Latin
sea
America.
posible?
And what
Son
helps
las
this
asociaciones, asociaciones
ensure that
o
this is
sociedades
possible?
de la
It's the
ciencia
many
animal de
associations
laboratorio de
and
los
the
diversos
societies that
países,
exist
¿verdad?
regarding
Tenemos a
laboratory
Azochical
animals
de
in the various
Chile,
countries.
Azochical
You
de
have
Brasil,
Xochical
ABECAL de
in
Panamá,
Chile,
todos
Abecal
esos
in
ahí que algo de
Cebal in
información
Panama.
todavía, pero
Some are still
buscando qué es
being
lo
set up,
qué es lo
but
que han hecho, divulgan lo
as
que
to
es la
what they
ciencia de
have
animales de
done,
laboratorio. No que
they
tiene
provide
pocos libros,
information
pero
on
ahí
what
están
laboratory
luchando, trabajando,
animal
estamos acompañando
sciences
mucho el
is,
trabajo
but they're
de
very few
esos miembros
members.
de esas
They are
asociaciones,
trying to organize
organizan
meetings,
encuentros,
congresses,
congresos, seminarios,
seminars,
cursos
courses,
y presiona a los
and
políticos
they
para que oigan
lobby and
sus
put pressure on
necesidades. Y ahora esas
politicians to
asociaciones
ensure
están
that
mucho
their
más fuertes porque
needs are met.
tenemos dos
So these
federaciones
organizations are
muy
now
activas, que
stronger because
FESACAL,
we have two very
Federación de
strong
las
active
Sociedades
ones,
Suramericanas, y
FESACAL
FESANCAL,
and
Centroamericanas del
FESAHANCAL, the
Caribe y
Central
la
American,
América del
Caribbean,
Norte
and
los
North
de lengua
American
hispana,
region that
que
speaks
están
Spanish,
en una meta
and
incluso
FESACALs
de
in South
FESACAL,
America.
que
Their
está muy
goal
fuerte en la
is
cuestión de
to
ayudar a los
uh,
países en la cuestión de la
help
legislación.
countries in
Quizá no
drafting
tengamos fuerza con los gobiernos,
legislation.
pero
They
para
may not
ayudarlos
have
a elaborar
uh,
sus proyectos de
force with the
leyes y
governments, they
los
may not be
leyes
able to
necesarios, FESACAL
push
ha
the
sido muy
governments,
activa
but
en
they
eso
are helping
y
the
ha trabajado mucho
local
con eso.
organizations to
Entonces, esa es la
develop
meta que
the
tenemos.
system.
Es
So
una
our goal
legislación para
is
América
to
Latina
have
para que
legislation throughout
podamos
all of
estar
Latin
al día
America
con todo el
so
mundo.
that we
Las leyes
can
del mundo todo se
be in
basa en las
harmony
de
with the
ustedes.
rest of the
Nosotros
world. And
solo tenemos que colocarlos
the
en nuestra
laws in the world,
legislación
the global
nacional.
laws are
Y
based
les
on
digo
three
que esa
law
América que
R's. So that's
tiembla de
what we have to do in
huracanes,
our
que
own
pide amor,
legislation.
según Rubén
And
Darío, es una América de
according
hermanos.
to Rubén
Y si nos
Darío,
damos las manos,
the Americas is a
avanzaremos muy clarito,
continent of
avanzaremos a
love
llegar
and
legislación a
brotherhoods.
todos
And
los
if we can
países. Y
be
por eso
that
les
way
dejo
and
acá
be
un gran
brothers
abrazo
and sisters, we
latinoamericano
will
y
be able to
las
achieve this in
referencias
Latin
de que me
America.
he
That's why I
basado
extend to you in
para
Latin
poder
American
hacer esa
hug.
presentación
And below
para
that, the
ustedes.
references
Muchísimas
for
gracias.
my presentation. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Ekaterina,
you very much,
por la
Ekaterina,
presentación, por las
for your
referencias, por la
presentation,
reflexión
the
también.
references,
Vamos a continuar
and the
ahora
ideas you've
con
given
una
us.
serie,
We
con,
will move
con
on now
preguntas de la
to
audiencia, tanto para
questions
ella
by
como
the audience,
para
both for you
Nicolette.
as well as for
Invitamos
Nicolette.
To
We
join
invite
us.
you,
Please,
Nicolette,
Nicolette,
to
there you
join
are.
us.
Ah,
There you
quiero,
are.
antes de pasar a las
Before
preguntas
moving on to
que
the actual questions
moderará Sara
that
Carracedo
will be
nuevamente, quiero
related. by Sara Carraceda, I would like to
paralelo
give
a la
you
evolución
a consideration
se viene
parallel to
logrando
the
en
actual
nuestra
evolution
región
that has
en
been achieved in
materia de
our region
asegurar el
on
trato
the score
ético
of
a los
ensuring
seres
ethical
humanos que
treatment for
participan en las
human beings who
investigaciones.
participate
En
in
primer lugar,
this
nada se
research.
logra de un día
First
para
of all,
otro.
nothing
Es
can be
un
done from one
proceso
day to the
y en
next.
ese
It is a
proceso
process.
inicialmente tienen un rol
Initially,
importante las instituciones que
institutions
lideran
have
la
an important
investigación, que
role,
están más
those
al
which are
tanto
ahead
de
of
los
the
estándares
research,
internacionales
who are
y
informed
buscan
about
ponerlos
international
en
standards,
práctica en sus
which seek out to
instituciones,
put them in practice in their own
pero luego se
institutions.
pasa de que ser
However,
algo,
then we move on
en las distintas jurisdicciones o en los países. Y para eso hay un gran camino por recorrer. Ese era mi primer comentario. Mi segundo comentario es que ambas presentaciones han mostrado que, que nuevamente, como hablamos,
that once
tal
again,
como lo decimos en materia
and
de
as we
ética e
say it
investigación
with
con seres
regard
humanos,
to
que
research
lo
with
que es
human beings
necesario
as
es
well,
un
what is
sistema,
necessary is to have a system,
donde no
a
solamente
system
un investigador
whereby not just
que
one
se
researcher
asegura de que todo se haga bien,
may become
es
certain
el
that everything is
investigador,
done
el
correctly.
SIGUAL, la normativa, la
It
institución.
is the
Entonces hay
researcher, the investigation, the
digamos,
sequel.
voz
So there
de
is this whole
componentes que
forest,
es
let us call
esencial
it, of
para
components,
asegurar
which
un
is
trato
paramount
ético de
in
los
order to
animales
ensure
del
ethical
laboratorio.
treatment for
Creo que tenemos
laboratory
como región
animals.
mucho por
As a
recorrer,
region, we
pero
have
le doy
much to
ahora la
be
palabra
done, but now I would like to yield the
a
floor
Sara para que
to
modere la
Sarah
pregunta.
for her
Gracias.
to moderate this portion
Gracias,
of
Carla,
the
y
QA
gracias, Caterina,
portion.
por la charla.
Thank you,
Hay varias
Ekaterina, for your
preguntas, así
presentation. We
que
have several
voy a
questions,
tratar de
so I
organizarlas
will
para
try
llegar a
to
todas
organize them
y
so that we
creo que es
can
mejor
take
si
them
empezamos por lo
all.
básico.
And let us
¿Por
start by
qué
that which is
es tan
basic.
importante hacer
Why is it
investigaciones
so
con
important
animales?
to conduct research with animals? Why is
Caterina,
that?
Nicolette,
Ekaterina or Nicolette, whomever, you can,
dar
of
sus
course,
respuestas
give your
cuando
answers
quieran.
whenever you wish. Go ahead.
Nicolette?
Nicolette?
So I think we are, the United States is certainly looking at alternatives to the use of animals. There are complementary methods, but we can't replace all types of research with non-animal methods. It depends on the scientific question, and it depends on the system that you're looking at. I think we need to minimize animal use to that which is necessary, and that's where the institutional animal care and use committees are so important, because they evaluate the proposals for that. They evaluate what's being done with the animals and asking if it's necessary by doing a harm-benefit analysis, asking if the protocol is likely to produce the intended results, whether the pain and distress in the animals are being minimized. So as much as I would like to see a time when no animals need to be used in science, I don't believe we're there yet.
Yo creo que solamente para, digamos,
believe, and in order to
corroborar lo que dijo
corroborate
Nicolette,
precisely what
que
Nicolette has
estamos
just told
buscando
us,
el uso de
we are
alternativas y
looking
aquí en
for
Brasil ya
alternatives.
tenemos
And here in
una
Brazil,
cantidad
we
bastante
already
grande
have
de
a
alternativas
large
que pueden
number
ser
of
utilizadas
alternatives
en
which
lugar de
may
los
be used
animales.
instead of using
Incentivamos el uso de
animals.
alternativas,
And
así que
we
la primera
promote the use of
pregunta que
such
se
alternatives. So
hace
the first
cuando se
question
llena
that we ask ourselves
proyecto de
whenever
investigación
a
es,
research
no
project
hay
comes
ningún método
before us is,
alternativo, si no hay,
isn't
¿por
there
qué
any
usted
alternative
justifique
method?
por qué utilizará
Otherwise, how
animales?
can you
Entonces,
justify
ese es el
why is it
primer
that you're going
punto.
to be using animals?
Pero
That's the
aún,
first
como
point.
dice ella, no podemos
But as
dejar
she
de
has told us,
utilizar
indeed,
algunos
we
animales
cannot stop
en
using
investigación.
certain
Es lo mismo que dijo
animals for
Nicolette,
research
yo
purposes.
solamente
This is
confirmo
exactly
lo que
what
dijo ella.
Nicolette said, and I just want to confirm what she stated.
Gracias.
Thank
La
you.
otra pregunta,
The
antes de
next
pasar a esta,
question,
creo que vamos a pasar a otra
before
más
moving
general,
to this
que
one, we'll
está
go to another
relacionada con
general
los
question,
comités.
which has to do with the
¿Por qué
committees.
un comité de ética de la
Why is it that an
investigación que
ethics
revisa
committee for
investigaciones
research
con seres
that
humanos
reviews
no
research
tiene
with
la
humans
competencia, no
doesn't
debería
have the
revisar las
possibility of
investigaciones
reviewing
con
also
animales?
research with animals?
Yo creo que el enfoque es bastante
I believe that the
diferente.
approach is
Nosotros,
quite
porque la
different
ley de Brasil
because
dice que hay que
legislation in
haber un
Brazil
comité de
states
ética solamente
that
para
there
animales.
has
Nosotros
to be
tenemos que
an ethics
seguir la
committee
ley.
just for animals,
¿Eh?
and we have to stick
Entonces, por
ourselves to the
eso,
law.
y cuando
So,
nosotros tuvimos mucho tiempo
for a
que
long time,
teníamos, digamos, el comité de ética con humanos
we
junto con
had
el comité de ética
the ethics committee
de investigación
of
con
humans
animales
together with
una
that of
época y no
human
funcionaba
research
muy bien porque las
during
personas
some time,
involucradas
but it
tenían
didn't work
otros,
too well because people
no tenían
involved
conocimiento
didn't have
total
the
y casi siempre solamente el
total
veterinario
knowledge.
que
Maybe
participaba
just
del
the
comité era que
veterinarian who
contestaba las
participated
preguntas
in the
o
committee was the one who
evaluaba
could
el
respond
protocolo de
or
investigación.
evaluate the
Entonces hay que
research
haber un
protocols.
cuerpo de
So
personas
there has to be a whole
más
body
especializadas
of
para
people
cada área, para
who
el
are
área animal y
specialized in
para
each one of
el
the
área
areas,
biomar.
both the human as well
Esa
as the
es
human
la
area.
solución.
That is my idea.
Además de legal, de la
Plus the
cuestión
legal
legal que
aspects, of
tenemos
course,
que tener.
the legal aspects that we have to
Gracias,
bear in
Caterina.
mind.
Nicolette,
Thank you,
¿quieres
Caterina.
agregar algo
Nicolette, would you like to
eso?
add something in this regard?
What Ekaterina said makes perfect sense. In the United States, we have required membership positions for institutional animal care and use committees. These include scientists who are experienced with working with animals, non-scientists who can provide a public perspective, someone who's not affiliated with the institution, so there's a sort of an unbiased viewpoint from another perspective, and of course the veterinarian. So it's a lot of expertise, and some of it may be specific to animals as opposed to human research.
Yeah.
Gracias, gracias por las respuestas.
Thank you
Creo
very
que es
much for your
importante
answers.
resaltar
I
que
think
los
it's important to
estándares para
highlight
realizar
the
un tipo
standards
de
for
investigación y
to
la
review
otra
a
son
certain type of
totalmente
research, and
distintos,
the
así
other are
como las
totally different,
competencias del grupo, ¿no?
as well
Como,
as
como comité.
the
Una
capabilities of the
tercera
group as
pregunta
a
está
committee. A
relacionada
third
con
question we
la
have
investigación
has
que
to
usa
do
animales
with the research
silvestres.
that uses wild
¿Cómo es
animals.
este
How is
procedimiento?
this
¿Cuáles son los
procedure?
estándares que hay que
Like,
aplicar
what are the
cuando
standards
hacemos
that have to be
investigación
applied when we
biomédica
conduct
que
biomedical
usan no
research
animales
using
laboratorios,
not
sino animales
laboratory animals,
silvestres?
but
Tal
rather
vez nos puedan
wild
dar algunas
animals?
luces sobre
Perhaps
este tema.
can you throw some light on this topic?
Yo puedo decirles que
I can tell
cómo
you that
actuamos nosotros es que
the way in
hay
which we
el
work,
proyecto de
we
investigación
have a
tiene
research
que tener
project that must
ser
have
evaluado por el
must
comité
be
de
assessed,
ética
evaluated by
y
the
además
ethics
de eso
committee,
tienen que
and
ser
besides that,
anexados del
it,
permiso del
a permit
órgano
has to be
de
attached by the
environmental agency del
environmental
país de Brasil,
agency
que
of
es que
Brazil, in this
regulamente
case,
el uso
which
de
regulates the
wild
use
de animales
of
silvestres.
wild
Entonces,
animals.
es evaluado,
So
pero también
it
se
is
busca
thus
siempre un
assessed, but
expertise
also we try to
para
seek
ayudar en
out
la evaluación
expertise that will
de
help in the assessment
de
and
ese
evaluation
protocolo.
of such
Y
protocol.
además de eso,
And
tiene que ser
besides
dada
that,
la anuencia, digamos,
there has to be
del
the
órgano
acceptance by the
que regularmente en Brasil se llama
organization
IBAMA, que es
called
Instituto
IBAMA in
de
the
Medio
case of
Ambiente,
Brazil,
que
which
tiene
is
que
in charge of the
analizar para ver
environment
si no es
and which
una
also
especie de extinción,
have
endangered
to
species o cualquier
determine when
otro
there
tipo
is an
de
endangered
animales, ¿sí?
species or of any
Así
of
que
these
actuamos
kinds of
aquí, no sé,
wild animals.
Nicolette, si quiere decir
So I
algo
don't know
más.
if Nicolette wishes to say something else on this matter, on this.
I can speak from the perspective of the United States, and that this is very complicated. We also require animal care and use committee review of certain aspects of these activities. And unless it's observational only, a protocol is required. But remember that you're involving people in some dangerous situations too. And the NIH has occupational health and safety requirements as well. So if you've got someone climbing into a cave or rappelling down a mountain, it's really important to make sure that the people involved are safe. It's also important to think about the effects on the environment, the disposition of the animals, and the guide for the care and use of laboratory animals does talk about consulting experts and associations. And all of these are really species specific, because what you might need for collection of birds could be very different than what you need for collection of bats or or reptiles. So it's really species and situationally dependent, but it does require oversight for anything that is more than observational.
Solamente para completar, Sara, lo que dijo Nicolette
To
es muy
complement what
cierto,
Nicolette just told
pero
us,
lo que,
which is
también
indeed very
esa
true,
parte que dice ella
but also what
los
she has
riesgos
told us
que
regarding the
pasan,
risks.
todo eso es dado entonces por ese otro órgano que es el órgano
There's another
medio ambiente de
organization
Brasil,
which has to
ese
do
da toda
with in the
esa
environment in
cuestión
Brazil, who takes care
si endangered
precisely of
species,
this
si
problem,
hay
also
problemas
deals
para el
with
medio
endangered
ambiente
species, so
también,
this
ese
poses
dado por
problems
el
for the
órgano. Entonces
environment.
tiene que
All of
tener
that has
dos
to be assessed.
licencias para
So there
poder
have to
hacer
be
investigación con animales de
two
laboratorio.
permits in order to conduct this type
De
of
wild
research
silvestres.
with
Silvestres.
wild
Ajá.
animals.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bueno, creo que la presentación
I
de Caterina
deem that
sobre
Caterina's
la tarea
presentation
pendiente que tienen
on
muchas
the pending
legislaciones
tasks
latinoamericanas
and the very many
Latinoamérica
legislation processes in Latin America
evidente,
has
ilustradora.
been very
Y
obvious, has
esta
given
pregunta
us
está
much information.
relacionada
And this
con la
next question
ausencia
has
de
to do
legislaciones. Como
with
en
the
muchos
lack of
países, no
legislation.
tenemos legislaciones,
In many
marcos
countries, we
jurídicos
have no
sobre la
legislation, no legal
investigación
framework on
con
the actual
animales de
research
laboratorio.
with
¿Qué recomendarían
laboratory
ustedes
animals. What would you
para que las
recommend
instituciones
so that
puedan
the
asegurar que
institutions
estos tipos de
may make
investigaciones
certain that
se
this type of
realicen
research
de manera
may be
ética
conducted in an
en el país,
ethical
en la institución?
manner in the country or the institution concerned?
Yo creo que tiene más problemas somos nosotros,
I believe
no
that the ones that
Nicolette,
have the
Estados
most
Unidos.
problems is us
Entonces,
and not
por eso voy a
Nicolette in the
contestar.
US of A. This
Pero
is
yo
why I'm
creo
going
que
to be answering
tiene,
first.
lo que yo haría
What I would
es lo
do
mismo que empezamos con
is
los primeros
precisely the
pasos
same
en
thing
Brasil,
that we
porque
did with the first
independe,
steps here in
puedo
Brazil,
sentir y
because
todos los
I
que
can
hemos hablado y
understand,
trabajado
and
es
all of
que
us who have been working on
el
this
problema político
realize
está
that the
muy difícil
political
para
issue
poder pasar
is
por el
very
Congreso
much,
la
is
ley
very
para
important.
que sea
In
una
order
ley.
to
Entonces,
have
yo creo
a
que las
bill go
instituciones
through
tendrían que
Congress
tener
calls
comités
for
de ética
much
muy
pressure.
serios,
There have to be very
muy
serious ethical
organizados,
committees, very well organized, that will
que
allow
fueran
for such
reconocidos quizás por el
legislation to be
Ministerio de
adopted,
Educación,
to
el
be
Ministerio
recognized by the
de
ministries
Ciencia y
of
Tecnología de su
education,
país,
of
que es
science and
más fácil para
technology
eso,
in the
que el
country,
Ministerio de Ciencia y
with
Tecnología de su país
Ministry of
diga
Science
que
and
ningún
Technology
trabajo con
could say, for
animales
example, that no
puede
work
ganar
done with animals
financiamiento, por ejemplo, si no pasa por un comité
can
de
get
ética.
funding
Aquí
unless it goes
empezamos
through an
así.
ethics committee. This
Entonces
is the way
trabajamos muy
we
bien por mucho tiempo
think of
porque
this
todos
here in Brazil.
querían que
And
sus
we've been
trabajos
working well because
fuesen
everybody
reconocidos,
wanted for the
necesitaban de
work to be
financiamiento para sus
recognized, but they
investigaciones.
needed evidence for
Entonces
the
trabajó muy
research
bien. Ahí el
and they
momento
needed
que
funding.
conseguimos
And at a certain point,
aprobar la
we
ley,
managed to have the
entonces eso quedó todo
legislation
más fácil también.
adopted
Pero
and
la
things
ley
were made much
independe de
easier.
los
But
científicos
the
y
law
depende del
depends
proyecto,
from
por
the
mejor que sea.
scientists and the
Y
projects.
la
No
ley para
matter
ser aprobada
how good
necesita del
the
Congreso
project is,
Nacional. Del
an
Congreso
important thing is to
Nacional
have the
que dé
approval
una
of the
ayuda de
National
políticos.
Congress.
Entonces
So it
hay
is
que trabajar en eso. Cada
eventually
país
a
tiene
decision
su
by
forma de
politicians.
actuar en
Every
esa área.
country has its
Eso es lo
form
que pienso yo.
in which it works in this area. That's what I think. Thank you.
Gracias, Caterina.
Thank you,
Nicolette,
Caterina.
¿tú tienes alguna
Nicolette, do you have something,
recomendación para
some
las
recommendation you can
instituciones?
give us
¿Cómo
for the
deberían empezar
institutions
a
as to how
manejar
they ought to start
estos temas para asegurar
handling
que
these
la
issues to
investigación
make
con
certain that
animales de laboratorio se
research with
realice
lab
de
animals
manera
may
ética?
be conducted in an ethical way?
Well, I can't speak to the political component because everyone's country is so different and the processes for lawmaking are very different. What I can say is that there are associations for voluntary accreditation, such as ALAC International, that can require for accreditation. It's not doesn't have the force of law or regulation, but a voluntary accreditation with those groups show a commitment to ethical care of and use of research animals. That's one way to approach it, even if there are no requirements in place.
And speaking about ALAC, it's interesting because we have some accredited facilities here in Latin America. And it's amazing because I think the island of Saint Tomé and Prince, they don't have many things, but they have an accredited facility, if I'm not wrong there, you know. So I think ALAC is a great help too. it's a great help too. Thanks, Nicolette, for reminding about that.
Gracias, gracias
Thank you.
por las respuestas. Creo que
Thank you
también
both for
es
your
importante hacer
answers.
un paralelo
It is important to establish a
con
parallel
los
here
avances que hemos
with the
alcanzado en la
progress
región
that
con la
we have
investigación con
managed to
personas,
have
¿no?
in
Hemos
the region
logrado
with
dar
the
pasos
research
importantes no solo
in
con
humans.
leyes, sino
We have
con
taken important steps not
instrumentos
only by way of
jurídicos
legislation, but by
de
way
orden menor.
of
Las
lower
revistas, por
level
ejemplo, también
legal
tienen un
instruments.
rol importante
Magazines also
al
play an
requerir que, por
important
ejemplo,
role
solo se publiquen
in
los estudios
asking
que
that
han sido
only
previamente
those studies that
aprobados
have been
del CICUAL.
previously
Carla mencionaba esto de
approved
que
by
la
SQL
garantizar
may
que la
be
investigación
published.
sea
To
ética
guarantee
no
that
solamente es
the
tarea del investigador,
research is
sino
ethical,
que
it
trabajar
only
a
has
modo
to
de
consider not just
sistema
the
en donde
researcher, but
hay
work as an
diferentes
entire
partes y
system
diferentes
where different
responsabilidades,
elements
todas
and various
apuntando a que
responsibilities,
esto
all of them
realmente se
geared
haga
toward this
de
to
manera
be
ética.
conducted in an
Tengo
ethical
acá
manner.
un par de preguntas, creo que
Next, I
podemos
have a
ir a un
couple
par de
questions. I
preguntas
believe that we
aún.
can take a couple
Eh,
more
Nos
questions
preguntan si
if you
es
want. They're
posible
asking
tener
us
una
whether it is
suerte
possible
de
to have
formulario
some sort
universal
of
para
universal
la
form
revisión de protocolos,
in
es
order
decir,
to have a
que
protocol
los comités,
review
los ICUALES
or reviewing
tengan
protocols so that the sequales, the
algún
committees, that
instrumento
is,
que
may
permita
have some
unificar
instrument
los
that will
criterios de
allow to
evaluación.
unify
Hemos hablado
the
de los
assessment
estándares,
criteria. We've
tal
spoken
vez
about the
podrían
standards. Perhaps
incidir en eso
you
un
could
poquito más.
speak a little bit more on that particular
¿Quieres
topic.
hablar, Nicolette?
Nicolette, do you wish to respond?
In
Sure.
Brazil,
I think you need to be careful what you ask for because there's a wide range of research. Field studies with animals where you're intercepting wild animals and manipulating them, that's very different from a laboratory animal environment. And I'm not sure you can use a common form as a starting point, but everything is going to need to be adjusted depending on the type of research. So those are just my thoughts on the topic.
we have by Conseil, the National Council, oh, perdão, eu estava falando em inglês. Conselho
Sorry, I was speaking
Nacional.
English.
Tiene
We
un
had the
modelo que puede
National
ser
Council
seguido
that has a
por sus
model that
adaptações,
can
como
be
dice
followed,
Nicolette. Entonces,
but with
tiene
adaptations, as Nicolette
si
has
alguien
said.
tiene
So if,
interés, uno
say,
puede mandar ese
if
modelo.
somebody's
Es muy
interested in it, I can send it to
pero,
you.
como dice ella,
It's
según el tipo de
interesting, but as Nicolette has said,
utiliza. Pero
depending on the
tiene un
type of
modelo
research
para
that you're
ayudar a
going to
personas que no
use,
saben ni por dónde hacer
I could perhaps
ese
give you a model for
tabla de
somebody that
saltos,
has
necesita,
no idea where to
pero no
start.
es
For that,
obligatorio
it
que
might
sea
be helpful,
completamente
but
igual.
it doesn't really
Según
have
el
to be
tipo de
exactly the
investigación que
same
va a
for
hacer.
everyone. Because a lot depends on the type of
Gracias.
research you're going to do. Thank you.
Más sobre los ICUALES.
More questions about the
¿Cuáles son
Yakuts.
las,
What
digamos, los procedimientos o
what are
cuáles
the
son las políticas que se deben
procedures
tener
or
en
policies
cuenta para
that
manejar los
need to be
conflictos
kept
de
in mind
interés
to
dentro
handle a
de los
conflict of
ICUAL, ¿no? Con los
interest
miembros
within a
de los
single,
ICUAL.
within the members of one single
Tiene-
Yakuk.
No sé si entendí bien la pregunta,
I'm
pero
not
para
sure I
resolver eso,
understood
porque
the
son problemas
question correctly,
éticos.
but this is
No
an
son problemas
ethical
legales que usted va
question.
a
It's not a
problemas
legal
éticos, entonces
issue.
hay
It's an
que,
ethical question you
hay
have
que
to
haber
look at.
consenso,
So
hay que haber mucha
there has to be
diplomacia también,
consensus.
pensar que
There
usted
has
no
to
es
be a lot
dueño
of
de la
diplomacy
razón
involved as
siempre,
well.
y entonces
You can't always be
yo
right.
creo que
And
saber,
so I
nosotros decimos
think
tener un juego de cintura, saber cómo llevarlo, no es
we
decir sí,
sometimes
pero y cada uno es diferente, hay un trabajo
feel
muy
that
interesante.
there's a lot
Yo
of
siempre leo
work
en un
involved
revista
because
que
each
el mismo problema es dado en
project
tres
is
diferentes
different. I've often
y las
seen
respuestas son diferentes.
that the same problem goes to
Entonces,
three different
eso va de
IACUCs
cada,
and
¿cómo
the
se
answers are all different. So
cómo arreglar sus problemas
how to
depende de
resolve
cada
the
área, porque
problem, I
son
think it's
problemas
really
éticos,
up
entonces
to
cómo
each
usted lo
committee
resuelve.
because it's an ethical question, really.
Pensando y
And
viendo
you
lo que se
have
puede
to,
hacer, para pensar, para
the whole
reflexionar
purpose is to
sobre lo que
think
tenemos
and reflect
que juzgar.
about what you are judging. So I
No sé si
don't,
es eso lo que
I'm
querían
not sure if
preguntar.
that's what the
Sí,
question
pero
was.
también
Well,
está
yes, but
relacionado a los
it's also
conflictos
more
de
related
interés que
to a
podría tener
conflict of
un
interest
miembro
that a
sí.
member
actual.
of
Entiendo
a
que
committee could have.
antes de unirse a un ciclo
My
hay que firmar
understanding is that
declaraciones
before you
de interés.
join
El
a
miembro tiene
Yakuk, you have
un conflicto
to
de interés en
sign
particular
a conflict of interest
para la
form.
revisión de un
If you
protocolo,
have a
vamos,
specific conflict
declararla y
interest on
abstenerse de la
reviewing a certain
revisión
protocol, you'd
de
have to
ese
declare that and then
protocolo de
abstain
investigación, digamos, son
from
los
reviewing
procedimientos que
that
sabemos
particular
están
project.
en lugar para
So
poder
the question has to do
manejar los
with
conflictos de interés que podrían
how do you handle
surgir
a
entre las
conflict of
actividades
interest
de los
that
comités
could
en general.
arise
No
from
sé si-
members within a committee?
Sí, sí,
Perdón,
dale.
Sara, perdón.
No, dale,
Siempre
I'm
antes
sorry,
hay
I
que firmar un
before
documento donde dices que no hay conflicto de
uh,
interés. Y,
anything,
por
you have to
ejemplo, cuando
sign a
estamos
document that says you have no
evaluando
conflict of
varios
interest.
protocolos de
And for instance,
investigación,
if you're
si
looking
el
at
mío está
revising
junto con
several
esos, yo tengo que
research
salir de la
protocols,
sala, yo
if
tengo que salir,
mine
yo no
is
puedo
involved, I
quedarme.
have to even leave
Entonces,
the room. I
así a
can't
esos
stay in the
cuidados
room.
todos
So
nosotros
yes, we do
tenemos.
have to make sure that there is no
Gracias.
conflict of interest
Nicolette, ¿tú quieres
whatsoever.
agregar
Nicolette, do you want to add to
algo
that?
a esa pregunta?
So the PHS policy, which is what I described as the basis for our requirements, it does talk about conflicts of interest in that no individual on the IACUC may review a protocol in which they are involved.
Yeah.
Right. So that is but there are lots of other things that might be considered a conflict of interest or might even cause the perception of a conflict of interest. And even the perception can be a problem. And in that case, there are flexibilities involved. For instance, one of the requirements in the PHS policy is for institutional animal care and use committees to inspect the research facilities at least every 6 months. So if someone is inspecting an area that they're in charge of, it's probably important to have them there to answer questions, but you want someone else to inspect with them so that there's additional viewpoints, and that sort of prevents that one person from maybe making a decision about the state of that area in terms of an inspection.
Okay.
Gracias. Hemos estado hablando sobre
Thank you. We've
la
been
investigación,
talking
pero
about
nos preguntan qué
research.
competencia tienen los
Now we're
visuales
asked
cuando,
what
por ejemplo, se
the
utilizan
power do
animales en actividades
Yakuk
de
has
docencia
when
o de
you use
enseñanza
animals for
ciencias
teaching
biomédicas.
purposes
¿Hay
or for
alguna guía?
biomedical
¿Hay
sciences?
algo que
Is
podamos
there any
decir
kind
sobre
of
ello?
guide or guideline about that? Is there anything you can say about that?
Nicolette, ¿quieres
Nicolette, do you want to start?
Sure. So the PHS policy definition of animal includes animals used for teaching. And I can just tell you that from some of the considerations I've heard IACUCs discuss for teaching is how many times will the animal be used for a certain procedure? How invasive is it? How well are students being supervised? How many students per animal? How many times does an animal get a blood draw or whatever procedure that the students are learning? And what are the criteria for removing the animal from the teaching? So these are things to consider, I think, when you're using animals for teaching.
En Brasil, nosotros, según la ley, nosotros solo podríamos utilizar
In
animales cuando
Brazil,
es
according to
estrictamente
law,
necesario.
we could only
Entonces,
use animals if it's strictly
en
necessary.
los
So
cursos de graduación,
in the
farmacología,
pharmacology
fisiología,
and
antropometría,
evaluation
usamos
courses,
alternativas,
physiology,
no
we
se
use
usan
other
los
options.
animales
We no longer use animals
enseñanza, prohibido para enseñanza en segundo
for
grado
education.
también,
It's also forbidden
antes de
for
entrar a la
uh,
universidad. Solamente
high
es
school
permitido para clases como de
use.
veterinaria
It's
y
only
de
used,
medicina y
allowed
técnica
for
laboratoria y
classes
veterinaria
in
cuando es necesario. Pero
veterinary
para poder dar
sciences,
la clase,
but
el profesor tiene que
to
pasar su
give the class,
proyecto
the
de
professor
clase
has
por
to
la comisión de
submit
ética. Tiene que ser
his
aprobado por la
project to the
comisión de
ethics
ética.
committee. It has to have been
Casi
approved
siempre lo
by the
hacen para
ethics
todo el
committee.
año y ahí
And
aprueba la
usually he
comisión
does
de
it for the
ética. Si
whole
no,
year
en enseñanza
and
ya no
receives the
utilizamos
approval.
animales,
Otherwise, we don't
ya hace
use
algunos años.
animals
Y eso ha sido un
in
gran paso
teaching for
hacia
about 2
una
years
mejor,
now.
mejor
And that's
utilización de
been
animales
a good
que
step
son también
towards a
protegidos
better
por la
use of
ley.
animals and to make sure they're protected by
Gracias.
law.
Bueno, hemos tenido muchas
Thank you. Well,
preguntas.
we've had a lot of
Eh,
questions.
Creo que, a ver, acá hay una más que que
There's one
acaba
more here that just
de
came up
llegar, que es sobre el monitoreo
that has to
que
do
se
with the
realizan a los protocolos
monitoring
una vez que el CICAR
done by a
aprueba
protocol.
el
Let's say once
protocolo
Yakuk has approved
digamos,
the
la
protocol
investigación
and the
inicia,
research project and the
¿cómo
research
se
starts,
realiza el monitoreo
what
por parte
kind
de
of
los CICAR de
monitoring
las
takes place
investigaciones en
on the,
curso?
how does the
Bueno, nuestra ley
Yakuk
obliga
supervise and make
igual
sure the research is done
hacer
properly?
visitas
Well,
a los
our
locales
law
donde se están
requires
haciendo
that
los
Yakuk
experimentos
go
para ver
to
si
visit
no
the
solamente lo que
installation where the
pusieron en
experiment is
papel,
be done,
si
to make
es
sure
muy
that
bonito
what they
están en
put in
papel, les
paper
vamos
may look
a
really nice on
poner los
paper,
animales de tal
but
forma y después cuando llegue la hora
when
ya
you
están cumpliendo. Entonces,
come
sí,
to seeing
hay
what's actually taking
obligación de
place or not
monitoreo y sí,
fulfilling what
en
they
ese
said.
monitoreo
So yes,
alguna
there is
cosa que se
monitoring. And
percibe
in that
que no está
monitoring,
bien,
if we
que no
see
está
that
de acuerdo
something's
con lo
not
que está
right
en el
or is
protocolo
not consistent with
que
what they
fue
said in the protocol,
evaluado, entonces
then
se habla para ver cómo
we
se
talk
puede
to them to see
arreglar.
how they can
¿Acaso el
correct it?
investigador
And
siga con
in the
la
event
cosa,
the
no quiere
researcher
seguir lo que dice
does not want
el comité de
to
ética,
follow
entonces se
what
le
the ethics
manda
committee suggests,
un informe
then
al
then the
Consejo
report is
Nacional, que
sent
él va
to
a
the
ver si es
National
necesario
Council
alguna penalidad o qué
to
va a dar
ask if there's
compensación a
something
quien no siguió
necessary to be
hacer.
done. What
Es
should any kind
bastante
of penalty
riguroso
be
eso,
imposed on
entonces
this person
eso
who's not
tenemos
following
que hay
the
sí
protocol?
monitoreo y es
So yes, there's
obligatorio.
fairly strict monitoring, and
No
it is
hay fecha,
mandatory.
digamos que cada
There's
tanto,
no
¿no? Pero
specific
hay
date
más
when it has to
exigencia
be
más.
done, but yes, there is
Gracias,
monitoring.
Ekaterina.
Thank you,
Nicolette,
Ekaterina.
nos
Nicolette,
quieres contar
do
cómo
you
se
want
realiza el
to tell us
monitoreo
how
por parte de
monitoring
los ICUALES?
is done by your IACUCs?
Right. So the PHS policy requires semi-annual inspections and program evaluations, and I talked a little bit about those. A lot of institutions have additional programs called post-approval monitoring programs, and they may have additional staff to check on the animals. The veterinary staff may make rounds to the laboratories to see how activities are being conducted. So there's quite a bit of variation, but the requirement for all institutions, the basic mandatory requirement, is semi-annual evaluations of the animal care and use program and semi-annual inspections of the facilities.
Me olvidé de decir que tenemos
I forgot to say that it's also mandatory that there be a veterinarian doctor who is responsible, and he always, or she always has to be visiting the facilities to make sure how the animals are being cared for, what their status is. That's also very important. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, there has to be continuous monitoring.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Ahora sí, creo que para terminar
Now,
puedo
I
hacer
think
una
to
última
conclude,
pregunta,
I'd like to ask
y
one
en vista de
last
que esto
question.
está dentro de una serie
And
de seminarios relacionados con
since this is a part of
la conducción de
seminars that have
ensayos
to
clínicos,
do
la realización de
with
ensayos clínicos, la
performing clinical
pregunta
trials,
está
the
relacionada con la
question
autoridad
is
regulatoria.
related to the regulatory authority. The question is, what is the role of the regulatory authority in this entire process of animal research using animals? Does it have any role? And if it does, what is its role? When I'm talking about the National Regulatory Authority, I'm talking about the National Regulatory Authority that is responsible for supervising clinical trials.
De la fiscalización. Porque yo pensé que estabas hablando del FDA, digamos, no.
Sí, me refiero a, por ejemplo, la FDA o Anvisa.
Sí, sí.
Si tienen algún rol en la investigación con animales.
Bueno,
yes, the FDA or Anvisa, do they have any role in animal monitoring? Well, Anvisa regulates medication and pesticides and toxic chemicals. Those are the two we have in Brazil. So Anvisa has signed.
Anvisa recibe.
Oh, well, let me explain
No,
this.
Anvisa hay laboratorios que prestan servicio para Anvisa.
There are laboratories that provide services to Anvisa. So tests on the animals,
recibem já os resultados
and
dos
then
exames,
they
e agora
receive the
estão
results
acertando
of
incluso
the
métodos alternativos
exams,
em seus
and
testes
they're
animais.
now using
Foi
alternative
confirmado
methods to using
acordo
animals,
junto com
and they've
CONSEA
signed an
para
agreement
que
with
todo
COSEA
tipo
so
de
that
teste alternativo que a los
all
animales que CONSEA apruebe,
these
Anvisa aprueba también.
alternatives
Pero
approved
el
by
papel
CONSEA
de
are
los
approved by
Anvisas es
Anvisa as
más,
well. But Anvisa's role
en realidad
is
acepta los
actually
testes, él no tiene papel
more one
de
where they accept the
fiscalización,
tests,
cualquier
but they
cosa.
don't
En
have
Brasil, quien tiene ese
the
papel
role of
de
supervising or
fiscalizar, de
monitoring.
evaluar cómo
In
está
Brazil, the one
la,
that's
la, cómo
responsible
está,
for
es el
monitoring,
CONSEA,
making
Consejo
sure how it
Nacional de
is
Controle de
CONSEA,
Experimentos Animais.
the National Council
De
on
los pesticidas, lo
Animal
mismo, las
Experiments.
mismas
And in
formas
terms of
de Anvisa.
pesticides,
Ellos
the
reciben los
same
testes,
as
ellos
in
no
Visa. They
fiscalizan los
get
testes,
the test, but
es
they don't
CONSEA quien
supervise.
fiscaliza.
They don't
Entonces,
monitor them.
a veces, algún
CONSEA that
teste que
does
é
it.
hecho para
So
Anvisa, CONSEA
if there's a
ve que no
test
está
done for
bien
Anvisa
hecho,
and
no está
CONSEA
de acuerdo
finds
con
that
lo que
it's
debe
not
ser,
done
entonces
correctly,
CONSEA es el que
then
va a
CONSEA
impedir eso o hablar que tiene que hacer
prevents
de
the
nuevo ese teste,
experiment from
cualquier
going
cosa, pero
on, or
no
they
es
ask to
Anvisa,
have it redone. But it's not Anvisa's
no
role
tiene
to
ese
do that.
papel.
Ajá.
No sé si era eso
Gracias.
que me preguntabas.
Sí,
Is that what you were asking?
sí, Nicolette, ¿tú
Yes.
quieres
Nicolette,
agregar algo sobre
you
esta
want to add
pregunta?
something on that question?
So I'm not sure I'm exactly clear on
Yes.
the question. I think, correct me if this is wrong, are we talking about human subjects research, or are we talking about safety testing, or both of these? Because in America, of course, we're like a lot of loosely coordinated agencies that the main agencies for animal welfare are the NIH, which have requirements on the basis of awarding support or funding. And the Animal Welfare Act is administered by USDA, APHIS Animal Care, and they're the ones who administer the law for animal welfare in research. We do have government agencies that do various levels of safety testing. And there are interagency committees that coordinate on reducing the use of animals for these tests. But I'm still not exactly clear on the question, so I apologize.
Sí, creo que la pregunta está orientada
I think the
al
question
rol de
was
la
directed to the
autoridad
actual role
nacional
of the
regulatoria
National
cuando se
Regulatory
hacen
Authority
estudios no clínicos como
whenever
parte de un
non-clinical
programa
studies are
para,
carried
digamos,
out as part
desarrollar
of
un
a program in order
medicamento
to
o una
develop a
vacuna,
certain
¿no? Entonces,
medication
si
or a
bien
vaccine.
la autoridad
Although the
regulatoria, digamos, no
regulatory authority
fiscaliza per
does
se esa
not
investigación,
regulate
sí
that
va a
research,
establecer los tipos de
it
estudios
does
no
establish the
clínicos
types of
que deben
non-clinical
presentar
studies
por
that
el
must be
patrocinador
presented
para
by
el
the
producto en
sponsor
desarrollo, ¿no?
for
Y tienen
whatever
que
product is
ver
being
esos
developed.
resultados para,
And they have
y
to look at
analizarlos
those
para
results and
determinar si es
analyze
que
them
pueden
in
empezar
order
las
to determine
investigaciones
whether
clínicas.
the
Eso, digamos, es
clinical
una
research
etapa
may be
previa
started or not.
al
But that's a
ensayo
stage which
clínico con
is
seres
prior
humanos
to the actual
per
clinical
se.
tests with
Bueno,
humans.
sí.
Para los animales
And in
también
the case of
lo que
animals,
dices. Ellos
precisely
dicen
what
cuáles
you have
tipos
said.
de
They
testes
say
o lo que
what
tenemos que
types
hacer,
of
lo que
tests
hablaste. Así es,
can
ya
be
estuve
made.
hablando.
Precisely what you said. This is the way they
Gracias.
perform.
Bueno,
Thank you.
estoy volviendo
Okay,
a
I
poner
am now going back
en el chat
to placing here in the
los
chat
estándares
the
internacionales de SIAMS
international
e ICLAS,
standard
porque muchas preguntas estaban
of
relacionadas
SIOMS and ECLAS,
con esos
because
temas.
many of the questions had
Y
to do with those
muchísimas gracias
topics.
por su participación.
Thank you
Creo que ha
so
sido
very much for your
una
participation.
discusión
Indeed,
bastante
our
rica. Hubo un
discussion
montón de
has been
preguntas.
quite rich.
No hemos
Very
podido
many
llegar
questions.
a
We
todas,
have not been able
pero
to
me
take each and every
despido y
one of them,
dejo
but
a
I would like
Carla
to say goodbye, and
para
I leave
terminar
Carla
el
with
webinar de
you
hoy. Muchas
to
gracias.
conclude today's webinar. I thank you
Muchas
so very
gracias a
much.
todos, gracias a
Thank
todos
you.
los
So thank
participantes,
you all
gracias a
to all
nuestras
participants,
expositoras.
to our presenters, of
Creo que
course.
es
I
indudable que la
believe that
conciencia
undoubtedly
moral
the moral
va
awareness
evolucionando y que es claro
is evolving,
que los
and it is
animales
quite
que
clear that
participan
animals which
que
are
se
part
usan en
and which are
investigaciones
used in
deben tener un
research
trato
must have,
debemos asegurar que
we must
de
make
sufrimiento,
certain,
un
that is,
trato
that there's no
adecuado
suffering,
general
that
y
there
que
is
si bien
adequate
este es
treatment
un
for them.
tema
And of course,
relativamente
this is a
nuevo para
topic which
nuestra
is
región.
quite
De hecho, es la
new
primera
in
vez
our
que la
region.
OPS
It is
hace un
as a point of fact, the first time that PAHO has a virtual seminar on this specific topic. So I think it is an issue which is part of our regional agenda. And we must try to reproduce the learning that we have acquired, ensuring ethical treatment of human participants in this research. We're all kindly invited to continue participating and following seminars in this series and also other seminars we may hold. And we have shared with you now the the link, so that you can subscribe to our list of ethical research, through which we will be sending you not just the resources that were comparted in this session and the recordings, but also an invitation to new seminars as part of this same series, and also other resources and publications of the Regional Bioethics Program of the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO. On behalf of the Regional Program of Bioethics, as well as the Quality and Regulation Unit for Medications and Sanitary Technology, we thank you so very much for your participation. May you have a very pleasant afternoon.